I guess I'll get started. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Emily Schlemowitz. I'm joined here with Devin McElrath. She's our Education and Collections Manager, and she's going to be helping me in the gallery, going around with our small camera so that we can zoom in on the works. I'm the curator at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, and I'm delighted today to give you a tour of our current exhibition, Remnants, which is up now through the end of the month. A few housekeeping things before we get started. There's a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask me questions, I'll try to monitor them. Or Devin, feel free to pipe in and ask me a question or two. Or Melissa, who's in the background, our director. For those of you on Facebook, my colleagues will also be monitoring the chat there, so they'll transfer the questions over to Zoom. The museum offers these programs, these free virtual programs monthly, typically on the first Friday of every month at noon. And we do this as a free program to engage our visitors, but we of course appreciate donations to keep our programming going. So thank you again, and we're really excited to share Remnants with you. So without further ado, I'm going to spend some time showing the exhibition through a PowerPoint presentation, and then talking a bit about some general threads that I see in the exhibition. And then we'll switch to Devin, and we'll be in the gallery and we'll do a walkthrough. And this is, we do have a website, of course, wiquiltmuseum.com, and you can also follow us on Instagram. WMQFA is our handle, and then also on Facebook. So please do that. Okay. So Remnants, the idea for Remnants actually began about 2 years ago. We were planning on hosting this show last spring, and then unfortunately had to postpone it due to COVID. So we were really delighted that all of the artists remained in the exhibition and were able to participate in the current exhibition. This exhibition really brings together an exceptional group of contemporary fiber artists whose work makes meaning from the textile fragments we encounter daily. Worn shirts, loose threads, attic relics, pocket detritus, discarded papers, fabric scraps, and abandoned plastics are just a few of the overlooked materials these artists use and turn into wondrous works of art. In this slide, I have wonderful works by Amy Meisner, which is on the table to the left, and then on the wall are 3 works by Susie Brandt. And I'll talk more about them, of course, but just wanted to give you a preview. And sorry, we went super quick. So the exhibition is comprised of 12 artists hailing from as far away as New York and California to close to home in Milwaukee and Madison. We generally try to do these big group shows at least once per year, focusing on a contemporary lens. So really bringing together a group of fiber artists and quilters. We are the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, and so we try to reflect that in our contemporary shows. And the work you will see today really ranges in scope from quilts to collage, sculpture to installation. So the exhibition includes Susie Brandt, Joe Cunningham, Patricia Ferreira, Pat Croft, Linda Marcus, Amy Meisner, Heidi Parks, Nirmal Raja, Michael Sylvan Robinson, Lauren Sinner, Holly Wong, and Sherry Lynn Wood. And this is a work by Nirmal Raja that's in the exhibition. The work in Remnants broadly addresses themes of repurposing, mending, and recycling. Additionally, there's often a sense of elongated time that permeates the practices of many of these artists, as though slowing down provides a connection between the found and the remade. Many of the artists created new works for the show, and I just want to say how appreciative we are of all the efforts that they put forth. Among the new works is a piece by California artist Holly Wong and modern artists Pat Croft and Patricia Ferreira. Wong created this work called Spiral Dance, which is comprised of colored pencil lyrically drawn on drafting film she has sewn together to create this large-scale organic structure that fits really perfectly within the framing of the barn. We also have Croft and Ferreira's work, which both employ plastics and small fiber fragments to attend to themes of reuse and ecology. Ferreira's embroideries depict fantastical portraits and botanicals made out of recycled plastics, beads, odds and ends from her studio. And Pat Croft's work is inspired by her fragments quilts, which are exuberant collages using bits of fabric, candy wrappers, fortune cookie fortunes, and cast-off notions. And she created this multicolored triptych for us using plastic. Another theme is the relationship between the home and fabric fragments, which runs throughout the work of Amy Meisner, Linda Marcus, and Lauren Sinner. Meisner typically works with abandoned domestic textiles, so doilies, table linens, among others, to draw out themes of femininity, motherhood, and women's work. And her work is on the table in the foreground. The accumulation of household items is significant for Marcus, whose exquisite wrapped sculptures take as their internal structure her children's clothing. Lauren Sinner's work conjures recollections of her Midwestern upbringing. Clothing's resonant qualities are the subject of the work by Susie Brandt, Michael Sylvan Robinson, and Nirmal Raja. Brandt's work, the three pieces here, are a poignant elegy to her partner, and it's made out of an abundance of aloha shirts she has carefully deconstructed and reconstructed into these portals and trees of life. We also have Michael Sylvan Robinson. He has an expansive practice, which includes refashioning elaborately patterned textiles into these wonderful sculptural garments that address largely themes of trauma and healing, among other things. And then we have Nirmal Raja, who works with repurposed saris to bring up themes of memory and place. The connection between vintage textiles and unknown makers is present in the quilts of Heidi Parks, Joe Cunningham, and Sherry Lynn Wood. Parks and Cunningham collaborated for several years on finishing a quilt by an unknown maker, which you can see on the right here, sending the fragments back and forth between Parks's Milwaukee studio and Cunningham's California locale. Wood's Intercession on the left is a story about fabric she found in the attic of her friend, the well-known quilt collector Eli Leon. Mining the attic stash, Wood asks, could this be Rosie Lee Tompkins fabric or textiles from another quilter Leon so cherished? So in general, this is a general shot of the exhibition, and we'll move into the exhibition shortly, but I just want to say that in general, our exhibition programming really aims to present exhibitions that exemplify both the traditional and evolving medium of fiber art to engage the viewer in broader conversations about fiber's associative emotional connotations and the artist's capacity for innovation and experimentation. And Remnants is part of that larger dialogue within our exhibition program to really embrace this sort of expansive view of fiber. So without further ado, let's move into the gallery. I'm gonna stop my share. And then okay. So the first Works you see on the left when you first walk into the gallery are works by Linda Marcus. She's an artist, textile designer, and clothing designer from Milwaukee. The one on the left on the wall is called Blue Nights. It's made out of hand-dyed recycled fabrics, cotton cording, and jute. Can you guys see this? Is anyone else having trouble? It's very small. Okay. Melissa, I think if you guys could pin the video, so you do that by hovering over the right-hand side, three white dots will appear. Okay, if you pin the video on the hide myself. Okay, I'm going to hide myself. Okay, does that work for everyone? Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, so you're just gonna hear my voice. Okay. So the first work when you first walk into the gallery is by Linda Marcus. She's an artist and textile and clothing designer from Milwaukee. This work is titled Blue Nights. She made it as a response to the pandemic, and the title takes its name from a book by Joan Didion. And so she was really influenced by, sort of the overwhelming sense of loss and grief and sort of this feeling of being stuck during the pandemic. And what she found, the items that she typically found comforting, like her bed and her jeans and sweaters, now really felt constricting. And she says, I felt as though I needed to change the utility of these items as a coping mechanism. So she braided these sheets, she dyed them, and she kind of thinks of the sheets as a metaphor for sort of, those damsels in fairy tales that would drape sheets out of window to escape. So you can see there's a lot of work that went into this, as well as a lot of different textures that she achieves through the use of these, combining these materials. And at the center is this kind of almost portal shape, as though she's, sort of this, like there's a heaviness to it, as though, really conveying this sense of grief. And she intended actually for it to hang on the ground as we have it displayed. Devin, if you want to back up a little bit. She intended for it to be displayed so that it sort of droops on the ground again, sort of having this emotive quality of, overwhelm or a sense of loss that was felt by her during the pandemic. The ball on the left was also just kind of a nod to Sheila Hicks and her wrap sculptures, which you can see up there. And wrapping is a big part of Linda Marcus's practice. We'll see another work that she did where she wraps her children's clothing. So this is kind of a thread within her works. She did make this work specifically for the exhibition. It was something that she was working on over the course of the year, in which we had to postpone the show. The work on the right is called Cuffed, and it's comprised of men's and women's white work shirts, synthetic gray hair, antique cufflinks, and it's draped over a red car jack. So this work, she was really thinking about sort of the costs of labor, as well as sort of the unpredictability that comes with that labor. And she uses an improvisational quilting technique as a way to show there's sort of no predetermined path. The synthetic gray hair was meant to symbolize sort of the cost of labor again, how you gray, right? And then on the bottom to the left, there are these window shapes. And that was, again, sort of a sense of loss, sort of an emptiness, a negative, creating a negative space within the quilt to convey this sort of sense of loss. The cufflinks are, I believe, taken from both family members, but also found. So, again, she's using a lot of her sort of familial domestic materials in her works to create these really evocative kind of portraits of life, right? Slices of life. Well, then I'm going to pan to the left. That is another work by Linda. It's called My Appearance Allows Me to Be in This Space, and a companion work, the silk print that you see on the right, is called Return. And this work was actually how I kind of got to know Linda's work. She made these, this is part of a series of sculptures that she made where she's wrapping her children's clothing in this thread. And I really think this sort of wrapping alludes to, sort of a close embrace, perhaps, thinking about her children, as well as sort of an encapsulation of deeply held memories. And you can kind of see she'll hold up a really thick one when she's installing and say, oh, these are jeans, or, maybe a smaller one might be her child's, t-shirt or what have you. So she's also made castings of these works in metal and in clay, and then she's photographed them and had them screen printed onto silk, which is displayed behind it. And just personally, I think there's a lot of sort of crossover between her work and Holly Wong's work, which we'll get to in a minute. That's directly behind her, just sort of the organic nature and the organic forms. So, just thinking sort of relationally within the space about, how the works relate is something that we do quite a bit. This quilt is by Joe Cunningham, very well-known quilter and quilt instructor based in California. It's called After the Glacier, and it's paint, spattered work clothing, cotton, and linen fabric. And I think there's something sort of tectonic about these forms, thinking about the title After the Glacier. You can see these sort of intersections of plates moving perhaps, but then also, he's also thinking about a lot in his works, sort of utilitarian nature of quilts and sort of labor, and, including his own work clothes in these quilts kind of alludes to that. His stitching is amazing. He uses a long arm quilter, long arm machine, but he also does some handwork. And you can see the paint splatters there. And, part of his jeans, perhaps a pocket. So he says of his work, I make quilts to be positive existential objects that will look and feel like something that can warm you against the coldness of the universe. Okay, so if we turn to the right, we're gonna we'll see work by Nirmal Raja. Nirmal is a wonderful artist from and curator in Milwaukee. She made 4 works for the exhibition. The first one is called Summer's End, which is the paperwork. This is made out of repurposed silk organza, and amat bark paper. I had to look up amat bark paper, but it's basically sort of a natural fiber paper, and which she's cut holes into and then used as a backdrop, a surface for weaving. And you can see she's woven these incredible silks and fibrous materials throughout the paper. This work is also new and is first being shown in the exhibition. And her work really examines themes of sort of global movement and the cultural and material legacies of colonialism and its human consequences. So both from a world perspective, but also a deeply personal one. She was born in India and lived in South Korea and Hong Kong before immigrating to the US in 1991. She says of her work, "I choose materials and processes intuitively, drawing from objects and imagery that have dual cultural and personal significance. For an immigrant, adaptability and mutability are survival. I mimic this fluidity using mutable materials like fabric, wax, and paper." And you can see on the right, she's made these wall works out of repurposed saris from her personal, from her collection and her family's collection. And they're just wonderful. She's kind of left the threads dangling. Those are works that are stuffed so that she gets this sort of sculptural quality out with them. And they're really quite wonderful. These are additional works by Nirmal, and these 3 sari works are all called Distortions, Distortions 1 through 3. So again, sort of thinking about, playing with fabric to sort of make these stuffed pieces. Spools of thread. And then there's this work that's just absolutely divine. I love the color of it. And here she's added some paint to the fabric. So to the right, we have a quilt by Heidi Parks. Heidi is a quilter and teacher in Milwaukee, very well-known quilt instructor. And this work is called A Breath Has 4 Parts. Heidi took a trip to India. It was a very anticipated trip to India in 2019. And she brought along some white fabric that she then quilted throughout her journey throughout her travels. And so the scraps that you're seeing are basically a travelogue of her time in India. And you can see there's some special ones. I'm going to try to call them out, and maybe Devin can find them. There's a free calendar insert. Devin, there's a request just to go a little bit slower. Maybe we're going a little too fast. There's scraps of saris, shopping bags, even a cotton tea bag. You can see she's used sort of a stuffing technique, kind of like a trapunto. Sometimes she's obscured things, you know, thinking about sort of memory and, you know, how memory is evoked through travel. I personally love that she's also included a pair of her scissors. There's a little stitching of scissors, as though, you know, these are very personal, very autobiographical, you know, portrait of her. See, I think that's the bag. Her title is based on a yogi concept. So she went there with her yoga teacher. She went to India with her yoga teacher, and she named the quilt when she got back. And just as a reminder, the title of the quilt is called A Breath Has Four Parts. And the title is based on this yogi concept of acknowledging the inhale, pause to transition, exhale, pause from induce. So this sort of cycle of breathing that's prevalent within yoga. You can tell I don't do yoga, so. Yeah, and there's her lungs, you know, sort of thinking about breath again. So as we pan to the right, we have work by the wonderful Michael Sylvan Robinson. And Devin, maybe you could step back just to see the full breadth of the installation, and then we can get into the individual works. So Sylvan's work is what you see when you kind of first walk into the gallery, and they were working on these works for a very pretty much right up till the end. Maybe they won't let me like me saying that, but you know, they made all these works for the exhibition, which is just absolutely incredible. I believe there's at least 7 or 8, and we decided to hang them in this sort of formation that has this kind of energy, because there's a lot of energy within their works. So you can see the centerpiece is called In Remembrance, We Honor the Lives of Those Lost in 2020 to Gun Violence. And so they're a part of this exhibition, this group called Gays Against Guns, oh my gosh, sorry, Gays Against Guns. And you can see there's, you know, this would have been a piece that they would have worn to a protest. And so we wanted to sort of just consider that in our installation. So there's just a lot of movement. All of the names are of people who have passed due to gun violence in 2020. And you can see, if you pan down, there's a statistic, 2020 gun deaths, 43,411, injured 39,363, which is just astounding. On the back of the jacket are also names of deceased in remembrance. We honor, remember the lives of those lost 2020 gun violence. And it's just an incredibly powerful piece, and also one that I think, you know, for our visitors, you know, we went, and for myself included, I didn't know that you know, those statistics. So I think it's also an educational piece. So typical of Sylvan's work is a sort of like collaging of lots of different materials. They use sequins, the fiber fragments. There's these loose threads that run throughout, which is just really wonderful to spend some time up close, buttons, and then these words and imagery that are very evocative. And throughout their work is this sort of theme of, trauma and healing. And one of the things that they and I talked about as we were, we had to cancel the show and postpone the show. And so we were talking on the phone, and they brought up this idea of remnants as resilience. And that's something that I think has really sort of stuck with me throughout this year, thinking about sort of collages and as a metaphor for like putting things back together, putting parts of ourself back together, healing. This one is called A Love Letter to Queer Descendants. This jacket is a double jacket. So the openings to the jacket, one side of the opening is on this side and the other side has another opening, and they're connected in the center. And this is called Composting Our Fears and Committing to Action. So this side is committing to action. And the other side is composting our fears. And they did this as a, they were at the Textile Center in Minneapolis, and they asked members coming in, what are some of your fears? And, how are you going to sort of commit, what actions are you going to commit to sort of overtake those fears? You can see there's the plague mask, the figure wearing a plague mask, and that was a fabric that they acquired prior to the pandemic, but has this, obviously this sort of resonant quality. So those are some of those fears. These two wonderful works are child's clothes. One of the ways that I knew Sylvan's work before this was they did a project called Urban Fae, which was they would go throughout their Brooklyn neighborhood and insert these sort of fairy costumes throughout their, sort of in their urban environment. I think of those when I look at these. So this one's called Trauma Healing. Again, there's this wonderful collage effect that they create through the overlapping of materials. And they haven't told me the significance of the Venus of Wool and Earth, but I believe that you can see there's just a real breadth of work that they did for this exhibition. It's just incredible. They've also this is their first museum show, so I'm sure the first of many. So as we pan to the right, we have an artist, Holly Wong, who's from California. This work is called Spiral Dance. Again, she made this work specifically for the exhibition. And her work really creates sort of installations and assemblages and works on paper, integrating non-traditional approaches with more traditional sewing techniques. So Spiral Dance is colored pencil on drafting film that she then runs through her sewing machine with this red thread. So you can see the red thread over the drafting film embedded, as it were. And she's really interested in sort of integrating sort of these non-traditional approaches with the more traditional sewing to sort of think about the history of women and women's work. She's also said that at her age, in her late 40s, she really just, she decided she wants to make big work. She wants to take up space as a woman and as an artist. And there's something very lyrical and gestural about her work, all of her works. It kind of reminds me a bit of a cloud or a forest canopy when you look up at it. The work was installed, it came to us in 4 parts, and we overlapped the pieces and then, per her instructions, of course, and then hung it. It took us quite a bit of effort to install. She was supposed to come actually, but unfortunately because of the pandemic, was not able to, but she did participate in a virtual program with us. So that is available on our YouTube. Again, these are sort of like self-portraits. They, autobiographical. She works on the floor, so there's this sort of, very sort of gestural, sort of bodily, dancerly element to her work. And the red thread she intends as a sort of meaning of her bloodline. So thinking about sort of heritage, but also, herself. And you can see, from every vantage point, there's something new that you see. It looks different from one side to the next, and has both this sort of transparent quality, but also this sort of, feeling of there's sturdiness, or, it has a real presence. If we pan to the right, we have another quilt by Joe Cunningham. This work is called Monument to Discarded Love. And actually, if you zoom in on the stitching, there are these piles of tires that you can see. Hopefully you can see those, yes. And so sort of thinking about sort of that word discard and, the pile of tires in relationship to that, and also thinking he's really kind of interested in sort of the history of utilitarian quilts, so thinking about labor again, and You see these car outlines. I mean, it's the stitching on his work is just incredible. He does use a long arm machine, kind of free form. And dyed fabrics. And there's something very landscape-like about this quilt. And again, something sort of primordial, or something, you know, sort of like those tectonic shapes in his previous one. If we turn to the left, we have a piece by Pat Croft. Pat is a quilter and teacher from Madison. This piece is called Fantastique. She made it specifically for our exhibition, and she is known for making sort of these fragment collage quilts comprised of tiny bits of fiber, trapped threads, and found objects. And so there's these trapped, what she calls her trapped threads, which are embedded into the two pieces of plastic bubble wrap that she encased, you know, the other plastic forms in. And the scale of these works remind me also the transparency and sort of the surface texture really reminds me of stained glass. And you can also see she's a runner, and so I can kind of see maybe her seeing the landscape at dawn. You know, it creates a sort of a landscape pattern when you view the work from a whole. Pat is actually going to have a solo exhibition at the museum next year. Can everyone hear me? There's someone that says that they can't hear me. Okay, so as we move to the left, we have a work by Sherry Lynn Wood. Sherry is a quilter and teacher from Ohio. This work is called Intercession Purple. And she describes it as patchwork made from remnants of an unknown quilter inherited from Eli Leon after his passing. And of course, Eli Leon had an astounding collection of over 3,000 African-American improvisational quilts, which he bequeathed to the Berkeley Art Museum and the Pacific Film Archive in 2019. Sherry was a good friend of Leon's, and so was invited to mine his stash in his attic. And so she asks, you know, could these be remnants of Rosie Lee Tompkins or another quilt maker whose legacy Eli recognized, cherished, and preserved? She really sees this work as sort of an offering to these incredible African-American quilt makers and improvisers who interceded and inspired her creative journey. So she's kept the remnants in their original shapes as much as she can, and has been slowly piecing together these bundles. And again, you can kind of see this idea of sort of an altar in the display of the work. They're displayed on a platform in front of this wonderful tapestry of fabric. And these really kind of wonderful, neatly piled bundles, which she's, I believe she's put color coded. This work she originally made for a a residency that she did at the Joan Mitchell Foundation. And of course, Sherry herself is an incredible improvisational quilter who teaches improvisational quilting throughout the US. You can see it's just this wonderful expanse. On the right, we have another quilt by Heidi and Joe Cunningham. This is actually a collaborative quilt that was made from an incomplete quilt that was in Cunningham's collection. So Heidi and Joe started to communicate in 2016 and decided that they wanted to do some sort of collaboration via fiber, and they decided to, finish this quilt by an unknown maker. It took them 4 years of sending the quilt back and forth between the two of them. And, they really talked about how quilts for both of them are sort of this expression of love and caring, and they have this shared passion for mending. So they made this quilt only out of gifted fabrics, and Heidi decided to actually keep the fabrics in the shape and condition, the shape that they were gifted to her in. So there's a funny one on the back, which I'll let Devin get to, which is in the shape of underpants. I don't know how she got that gift, but I think it's in the top right. Yeah, there. But you can see like this melding of their individual styles, so that running sort of serpentine fabric is really typical of Joe Cunningham. And then you can always see this, this stitching by Heidi, which is this kind of running sashiko stitch. On the right, we have another work by Michael Sylvan Robinson. This is called Morning Jacket for a Sweet Seder in remembrance of Eric J. Ginman, 11/13/69 to 7/1997. And I put this one a little bit separate from the other works because the works around it are, are other memorial objects, memorial works. And again, we sort of thought about displaying it in a way that kind of alludes to a body wearing it, but obviously that body is absent. And this was made in honor of one of his friends that passed. I think it was his partner, a partner that passed, a former boyfriend. And you can see there's words there, the back of it. There's just a lot of dignity in this piece. I feel like the construction of it and the tails, this is kind of when you think about tails, you think of something that's, you would wear maybe to a wedding or a funeral. And then in the interior are words, words about the deceased. when you pan to the right further, there's works by the wonderful Amy Meisner. Amy is a quilter and artist out of Alaska. She contributed 2 works to the exhibition, the one on the table and the quilts in the top right. And she really is drawn to abandoned textiles created by women. She intends to honor these unnamed needleworkers by providing a contemporary context for their possible narratives. You know, she uses doilies and silk organza in this piece, so vintage doilies that she's cut up. This work in particular is called Dissent, and Dissent is a response to her experience with postpartum depression. She struggled with postpartum depression for a while, longer than she thought she should, and, you know, was reading about it and realized that it can last up to 4 years, which was both comforting and also depressing for her. So she created this work that's kind of like a portal, and we made the table for it so that it's lit from underneath, and has this sort of silk organza at the center, which has this kind of allows the light to come through. The work behind that one is called I'm So Tired of Cleaning Up Your Mess. And it's made, again, out of what she calls abandoned needlepoint and vintage doilies. This one's called Inheritance, but it reads, I am so tired of cleaning up your mess. And so she's thinking about, sort of this internal dialogue that women have through the textiles, through mining these abandoned textiles, and sort of the landscape of women's lives and domesticity, and that intimacy of cloth, where maybe you could share, your innermost thoughts, which might be, I'm so tired of cleaning up your mess. She learned traditional sewing as a young girl, and then later worked as a seamstress in the garment industry. So she's a very skilled sewer. And you can see on the edges, she has embroidered this text, wound, mend, wound, mend, wound, mend, over and over. Again, kind of thinking about sort of that, internal dialogue of perhaps a woman's life. She also works with transparency in this work. There's another silk organza that frames the doilies. So the instructions were to hang it off the wall to get a sense of that transparency. As we come over to the right, we have work by Susie Brandt. Susie is a fiber artist based in Maryland. The 3 works are called Twister, Blusher, and Weeper. Twister and, so I should step back. So she made these works in response. Her partner passed away, and he had this collection of aloha shirts that I believe people wore to his funeral. And so she, after the funeral, she cut the aloha shirts up and made what she calls these tarps out of them. So Twister and Blusher depict trees of life, which are based on she based on 18th century modern print fabrics called palimpores. Palimpores are characterized by their designs featuring fantastical landscapes and foliage made for the European export market to be used as bed coverings. This is also known as chintz. These print designs have been knocked off over and over again, decade after decade, on upholstery and draperies and hippie curtains. And so she sort of uses that language within her designs. Again, this is a Tree of Life. And you can see it's on upholstery fabric, alluding to that idea of, chintz. So the one on the, you can see Devin backing up. The one on the right is called Weeper, and that is based on 19th century American mourning pictures that were stitched and painted by schoolgirls during the Victorian era. Mourning pictures featured angels, trumpets, Grecian urns, and weeping willows, as seen here. While functioning as memorials for deceased loved ones, they also exemplified cultural refinement for the young women of that era. Susie also wrote a really wonderful artist statement in which she says, remnants, what remains? So thinking about remnants as sort of the remains of one's life, the fabric remains of one's life. What do you do with the fabric, when someone passes? And within the weeping willow, there's these bird formations, cutouts. As we go a little bit further, we get Patricia Ferreira. Ferreira is an artist and teacher in Madison. These three works are called Guardian of the Forest, The Vigil, and Synthetic Garden. And they're made out of plastic bags, plastic and glass beads, and embroidery floss. Patricia was born in Uruguay. She really considers her work sort of these portals to another dimension where she can sort of live in these sort of imaginative and fantastic landscapes. You can see there's a close-up of the plastic bags that she's used in her embroidery. She's particularly inspired by nature and an interest in botany. And those are the glass beads. There's some really incredible textures in her work. She's also inspired by her love of Frida Kahlo, Henri Rousseau, and Sonia Delaunay. I kind of think that this might be a self-portrait, although she hasn't said that. But you can see definitely her influence on the influence of Frida Kahlo on her work. Again, sort of this idea of sort of paradise, I think, is really prevalent, and this, sort of an imaginative way to, escape or think about nature as an escape. We next get to work by Lauren Sinner. Lauren is an artist from Oregon. However, she is originally from Wisconsin. These two works are called Withered and Ruin. She is a textile artist and also an improv comedy. She's part of an improv comedy troupe. And so she utilizes found and handmade textiles in an effort to represent her mother's care. However, the textiles always have this sort of kind of a put together feeling, but also a falling apart feeling. And that's meant to represent sort of her complicated childhood. She paints these with India ink and embroiders them. And again, these are found textiles, found domestic textiles. There's a lot of botanical motifs within her work as well, similar to Patricia. So Withered on the left has this kind of overall botanical motif. And when you look at her work, you know, it's kind of, sometimes it's hard to tell the backside from the front side. And so I think that's on purpose, sort of this idea of kind of, you know, falling apart, of mending, of, you know, kind of this incompleteness. Devin, do you want to maybe just go through and show like the overall? So this is what you see when you walk into the gallery. And I know I'm running a bit out of time, but I'll let her just pan around a little bit more. And you can see those together. So I want to thank you all so much for coming and seeing this wonderful exhibition, and thank the artists in the audience. I really appreciate all your support and trust to show these incredibly sensitive and personal works. We obviously do these programs for free, but appreciate donations. So it'll be available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. And I'll stick around a little bit longer if there's some questions that you have. But again, thank you all so much.